Here at Rocket Sloth, we often joke, or half joke, or completely totally tinfoil hat level conspiracy level believe that when it comes to the Halo canon, when Bungie left 343, that was the end of the quote-unquote Bungie timeline for Halo. And since 343 Industries took over, went back and remastered Halo with new graphics, retold stories in different ways, and changed up certain parts of all of the Halo games that were originally released, essentially everything that lines up with the events of the Bungie timeline but was released under 343's leadership is kind of its own parallel universe, but still its own thing. Much like how in Marvel's Spider-Man cinematic universe, or whatever it has now become, a lot of the times the main stories can be the same, though they are different still. Typically, Peter Parker gets bit by a radioactive spider and becomes Spider-Man. But the deeper you dig into the story, you start to notice the nuanced differences. This will become really relevant later on in the video, so bear with me. Now, if you look at the history of Halo and you look at various interviews from the 2011 forward era, where 343 talks about the formation of 343 Industries, which was created essentially to take over the Halo helm when Bungie would leave the franchise after Halo Reach was published. This originally just started as a long shot idea that Bonnie Ross pitched, and it ended up getting greenlit and turned into the massive AAA developer that it is now. And as you guys know, we've been doing a lot of deep dives into the history of Halo, and along the way we've been connecting some dots that maybe other Halo fans haven't actually caught over the years, which reveals a lot of times massive shifts into the overall plan and direction or pathway that the Halo franchise was moving on, which in a way, if one decision early on wasn't made, the butterfly effect of where Halo would be today, in a real life sense, is just as fractured and almost confusing as what our in-lore universe could look like compared to the timeline we looked at earlier. But as it turns out, Microsoft had plans for what to do with Halo once Bungie left that did not involve 343 Industries at all. They were working on something for the franchise that, had 343 Industries never been created, the Halo franchise could look incredibly different than it does today. So let's take a closer look at Microsoft's Plan B. What if 343 Industries never existed? And oh boy, does this get interesting. Now, mind you, Luke, who edits all the Rocket Sloth videos, randomly decided to go on a trip to go soul searching or something and ended up in Korea. Yeah, I don't know how that happened. So while he's gone, I get free reign to just cover whatever I want, talk about whatever I want, and then of course I have to edit it all. But here we are. Now, most people know that 343 Industries was formed to take on the mantle of Halo after Bungie would depart from the Halo franchise. But one thing that not everybody quite knows is that this was not the original plan for Halo. And in an interview that Bonnie Ross did in between Halo 5's release before Halo Infinite would release, she actually shed some very interesting light to what Microsoft's Plan B was. And while I'm sure some of you have seen this interview clip, let's just take another look again just to get everyone caught up to speed.
Yes.
So it's a fun historical nugget for Halo fans.
Yes, Gearbox was one of the people that were
They'd done
listed.
the PC port of Combat Evolved.
Yeah, that was pretty much
They were
the one
kinda
that they were going to look at having them
Interesting.
do.
I wonder how that would have changed the course of their of their future, and if we ever would have got Borderlands and all kinds of stuff.
Now, of course, these discussions would have been happening at Microsoft maybe around 2006, maybe 2007, prior to Halo 3 originally releasing, and Bungie was still on board for 2 more Halo games, so this was way back. And remember, 343 Industries officially was greenlit and formed just in 2007. But even then, the idea of just passing on Halo to another studio didn't seem to have the most optimistic future for the franchise, especially in the way that part of this interview is worded.
Think of it as looking at it more from a business. Hey, Halo's great. Bungie doesn't want to do it anymore. But they were just basically like, hey, I think it's maybe good for another game or two, and let's just like cut our losses and like tell another story. We're just thinking of it more from a, hey, Halo 3 maybe is the end, and if it is, then let's just like tell a 4 story and wrap it up.
Now, of course, it is really interesting to think about what a Halo game developed by Gearbox would have looked like. Now, mind you, Gearbox's tenure with Halo just exists in Halo Combat Evolved PC Edition, where they did the PC and custom edition versions of the game. Those builds would later be used on the Master Chief Collection. But other than that, Gearbox did have a pretty big portfolio when it came to working on first-person shooters. And while we could speculate all day as to what a Gearbox-led Halo franchise could end up looking like, unfortunately there's not a lot of concrete information as to how far or whether or not Gearbox was even in the earliest prototype or idea pitching phase of game development. Instead, with this Halo deal falling, we would see Gearbox move on to pick up another very popular first-person shooter franchise in Duke Nukem Forever, which got pretty mixed reviews. But during the time right after this deal would have fallen through, Gearbox did really hit their stride when they were working on Borderlands, and Borderlands became this massively successful franchise, which even drew some inspiration from Halo.
Took that seed of thinking, it's like a way of thinking, and it changed the way we thought, and then we developed a new way of thinking that led to how we invented this technology that lets us procedurally generate all the weapons in Borderlands. I know, like, from the outside it seems like this massive gap, but for us it was like Halo, Borderlands, like that like the development string was that for us.
And I know it doesn't sound like necessarily that Halo has this massive influence into the Borderlands franchise, especially with Gearbox only really working on Halo all the way back for the PC port, which would have been pre-2003, unless Gearbox was already actively prototyping stuff for Halo based on their thought that they would be moving forward with Microsoft and the Halo franchise, and then when that deal fell through, they pivoted on, which is incredibly interesting because nobody talks about this kind of forgotten history of earliest stages of game development, and we can't confirm anything, but listening to this interview, I can't help but to think that there's a much closer connection to Halo and Borderlands than just them working on a port 7 or 8 years earlier. Still interesting nonetheless. However, when we look at the grand scheme of Microsoft, I don't think that even if they did go this route of working with an external studio to handle Halo, that this would be a long-term solution. I think inevitably, Microsoft would make the decision to bring all of development for Halo in-house. If you've followed Microsoft's track record and history over the years, acquiring new studios and handing over IPs or starting new IPs, this would be the path Microsoft would go down inevitably. And I think, believe it or not, 343 Industries would exist today in some form, whether it had a different name with different leadership, or maybe it would just be created at a later date than when it was initially pitched. But we're not done here yet, because things get even weirder when you start to dig into some interesting nuanced things about Halo's development. What if there were two 343 Industries simultaneously? This actually happened for a very, very brief amount of time, to the point where nobody really even knows that this existed, and it only recently was brought to my attention by a former developer. Let's back up a little bit. We've talked about this before, but Halo at its peak, right around the end of Halo 2, going into Halo 3, was really ramping up to be a massive franchise, and Microsoft really wanted to see a new Halo game released on a yearly basis. We saw that with Halo 3, Halo Wars, which would get delayed, but was more or less a year after Halo 3, Halo 3 ODST, and Halo Reach, followed by Combat Evolved Anniversary and Halo 4. In 2013, we only ended up getting a mobile game for Halo, and I think that was due to Microsoft choosing to pump the brakes on this original idea to go yearly with Halo. But I have serious reasons to believe that there was another Halo game that maybe would have been a spin-off planned to release a year after Halo 4 released in that 2013 gap, or maybe even a 2014 gap instead of what would become MCC. But with 343 working on Halo 4 and Halo 5, who would have made that Halo game? That's where we introduce 343 Industries, the sequel, or number 2, which would have been titled 343 Industries Vancouver. For a very brief moment, this was something that was going into effect over at a studio in Vancouver that Microsoft owned, where for a short amount of time, they were working on a prototype for a Halo game built in the Unreal Engine, that would end up getting scrapped by Microsoft, as a big acquisition that Microsoft had been working on for a while was going through, and this studio would end up getting repurposed once again and ended up no longer being 343 Industries Vancouver. We're talking about the modern day studio, the Coalition. Now mind you, Microsoft's game studio, the Coalition, was originally founded as a studio known as Zipline Studios, which existed from 2010 to 2011. Then this is where the history gets a little bit vague, but after 2011, for a while, the studio was renamed to Microsoft Game Studios Vancouver. It would then again be renamed in 2012 to Black Tusk Studios, and in 2014, Microsoft acquired the rights to the Gears of War franchise from Epic Games, which its development for a future title would be handed off to this studio, and they would eventually be renamed to the Coalition. Now, in their days before Gears of War, despite being acquired by Microsoft in 2011, they only briefly worked on a Microsoft Flight game, which was like a spin-off of the Flight Simulator series. And they also worked on a Kinect game called Project Columbia, which would get canceled. And they even saw some pretty big layoffs at the time. Now, that was back in their earliest years, but mind you, from 2012 to 2014, the studio wasn't publicly working on anything announced yet. And this is where things get really interesting. Over the years, there has been a lot of leaked information about some mysterious Halo prototypes or pitched Halo titles that ended up getting canceled. A lot of the work that have been revealed to exist from around the 2011 to 2012 timeline are often assumed to be work done internally at Microsoft or at 343 Industries in Seattle. This artwork, which had been revealed in 2016, showcases a lot of concept work done for a canceled Halo project that is speculated to have been canceled sometime in between 2010 and 2012. And this work was done by an artist for hire, Sasha Believ, who, mind you, lives in the Vancouver, Canada area. But the real breakthrough in my speculation of a 343 Industries Canada existing is the fact that a developer who formerly worked at the Coalition randomly reached out to me and was like, hey, do you remember when 343 Industries Vancouver existed? And I was like, what? And they went ahead and shared with me some images of some Halo related material that they acquired over the years from when they worked at the Coalition. Now, this developer did not actually work on the canceled Halo project. They came in later on when Gears of War was in development, but worked alongside people who had worked on the prototype. And of course, if you look closely at these images, you can see it saying property of Zipline Studios, the earliest development name before the studio was allegedly renamed to Microsoft Game Studios, and 343 Industries Vancouver. Now, what I believe happened likely was they worked on this prototype, and if it was to be greenlit, the studio would be renamed to 343 Industries Vancouver, and we would see yearly releases from Halo continuing forward, much like how Activision has multiple studios for Call of Duty, like Treyarch and Infinity Ward. This was what Microsoft was aiming to do with the Halo franchise for a while with the yearly releases, and obviously they would have to have a major studio alternating in between releases to keep up with that. But ultimately, I do tend to believe that this developer sharing some of this information with me, kind of off the record, would more than likely lean towards it being accurate, just because there's already been a lot of documentation of some mysterious canceled Halo project with a lot of the details and specifics missing, just because it couldn't quite line up to what some of the people, employees, and staff members at 343 Industries in Seattle were in fact working on. We also know for a fact that over the years, Halo has had so many different prototypes and pitches for games that ended up not getting greenlit, got canceled, or got scrapped in early development, like the Mega Bloks game, the Halo MMO. Even recently, Max Hoberman from Certain Affinity talked a little bit about how they pitched a lot of really cool Halo game ideas that ended up not coming through. So this isn't anything out of the usual. It's not even a black eye on Halo's history, but it is a forgotten piece of Halo history, and with just a little bit more confirmation that this studio for a brief time went by the name 343 Industries Vancouver, it could be a really cool piece of Halo history. It does paint a bigger picture. If 343 Industries was never created all the way back in 2007, we probably still would have a studio equivalent to 343 Industries taking on the Halo franchise moving forward, and likely employed by Microsoft hired employees. The only major difference would be that leadership could have been different. Though it is still interesting to think about what those Gearbox Halo games could have ended up looking like. That's the main gist of that part of the video, but I did really want to talk about my Halo timeline theory a little bit more just because I need to squeeze it in the video somehow or another. Okay, if we look at this lower 343 Industries timeline, Halo 2 Anniversary, we've talked about theoretically being a flashback of the Arbiter recounting his experiences during the time of Halo 2 and telling the story of Master Chief. This is a theory that has existed for a while, and it's mostly because of this random trailer for MCC to promote Halo 2 Anniversary, which straight up shows the Locke and the Arbiter walking through like this little mini museum setup that they made, showing all of the events of Master Chief. And it's interesting when you look closely because you see Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary assets, you see Halo 2 Anniversary, Halo 3, Halo 4, and Poncho Chief Halo 5 in this thing, which really throws things for a loop because that would mean at the time before Halo 5 happening, Poncho Chief would have had to have already happened, which does cause a little bit of confusion. But I do really enjoy this theory, even if the idea of Halo 2 Anniversary being a giant flashback isn't fully the most efficient way of storytelling. It does kind of come up with an interesting explanation for some of the little changes that we've seen along the way to the newer versions of the Halo games, whether it's skins in MCC or other little changes. Like in the 343 timeline, Breaking Benjamin didn't play in Master Chief's helmet during Gravemind. And while I'm not necessarily trying to sound like this big Halo purist that the original Bungie timeline just stops at the end of Halo 3, the reason I like this timeline is it could leave room to suggest that Halo exists in an in-universe capacity within Bungie's greater universe or multiverse. Ever since the beginning of Halo, there's been tons of references and callbacks to other games in the Bungie portfolio of titles. And while these obviously don't exist within the same exact timeline, there's a lot of thematic connections between games like Halo and, say, Marathon. One of my favorite things about the way that Halo 3 ended was the fact that it very closely mirrors the very beginning of how Marathon starts up.
The security officer is aboard a space shuttle called the Marauder. The Marauder has just entered orbit around a planet we do not yet know the name of. The security officer has apprehension, and again, we don't know why yet. He recalls a memory from 322 years earlier. How exactly was the security officer alive for that long? The more logical explanation is that he was in some sort of cryosleep while the shuttle was traveling through space. We do not know for sure.
And while these are clearly two different characters, back in the day, my headcanon was much as what your headcanon would be if you were watching a Spider-Man movie that abruptly ended when Uncle Ben was going into a convenience store or something. Yes, we know this Uncle Ben isn't that Uncle Ben, but I think we have a general idea of knowing what's going to happen here.
I lost my Uncle Ben. He was like a father to me.
Our protagonist wakes up in outer space. He's got some rampant AI shit going on. We could at the very least thematically conclude what the future of Master Chief's story would have looked like in the way that Bungie crafted the finale for Halo 3. It just really left the door open for a lot of thematic options. Alternatively speaking, in the Destiny franchise, we've seen a lot of Halo references, especially lately, with going as far as Master Chief's pod being found in a recent Bungie anniversary event. Obviously, this isn't the same Master Chief from the 343 timeline or even the Bungie timeline, but if you look at it in a less three-dimensional way, it is kind of interesting to see. I don't think they need to expand more on the original Halo story of the Bungie timeline. I'm fine with 343 Industries continuing the timeline as it is, but I also like being able to make these theoretical conclusions and see how the story evolves in this alternate way, which I strongly do feel like Bungie is starting to tap into a little bit with how they've made these really clever callbacks. I mean, there's even a Marathon helmet in Destiny and in Halo, so that's neat. There's a few other nuanced decisions that has happened during 343's era with Halo, where if there were multiple timelines, I would be more okay with them exploring some storylines and plots as long as it doesn't retroactively retcon the legacy and intentional writing from the older Halo games. Some really big examples of this that have kind of been pet peeves of mine for a while, some spoilers from the books and stuff, but things like Mickey betraying the rest of the ODSTs, which results in Rookie getting killed in a book, Guilty Spark being alive and getting this new robot form or something, and getting some redemption arc despite what he did to Sergeant Johnson, and Virgil not actually siding with humanity, not willing to really help Sergeant Johnson and the rest of humans figure out what the Covenant is looking for, being rather indifferent to whether or not the Halo rings get activated. If they want to go down those routes and explore what those stories would be like if those were the case, I'd be more accepting towards those stories as long as it would leave the original timeline and intention for these characters alone. So it's a great reason to embrace this idea of different timelines. I know this video kind of took two somewhat connected topics and covered them together, but I do think there is some relevancy there, and maybe someone in the comment section can find a better connection than what I did. I don't know. Let us know what you guys think. Do you think that I am completely wrong on the path of what Halo would have looked like had 343 Industries not gotten involved? Do you believe in this Vancouver 343 Industries that existed, or do you think that it could just be a bunch of hoopla? Either way, let us know what you think in the comments down below. Huge shout out to our patrons who have been keeping this channel afloat. We love you guys. Also, if you're a newer patron, your names will be added in probably the next video. Luke's just gone and I don't know how to edit the thing. But we see you and we thank you.